Good morning and welcome to Practical Christian Lessons. I am Joshua Pearsall. And we are returning to Stephen Gunter and Jacob Arminius in the Declaration of Sentiments. And we're going to get right on into it because I recorded this already today and it got corrupted as it was trying to render. So here we are. To anyone new to the series, go and watch our first two videos on this. One, because we're reading it in sequential order, but two, because the first video in the series lays some very important foundations for this. We'll have a link below in the doobly-doo for the one I'll be reading out of online. It does have many differences between Gunter's. The first video explains why. A bookmark's also in my notes. I need that. If the request of the deputies, we're starting number 4, the request of the deputies of the Synod of South Holland to their lordships, the visitors of the university, and the answer which they received. On the 9th of November, in the same year 1605, the deputies of the Synod of South Holland, Francis Landsbergis, Festus Hominis, and their associates, presented 9 questions to their lordships, the curators of the University of Leyden. These were accompanied with a petition that the professors of divinity might be commanded to answer them. But the curators replied that they couldn't on no account sanction by their consent the propounding of any questions to the professors of divinity. And if anyone supposed that something was taught in the university, contrary to truth and rectitude, that person had it in his power to refer the matter of his complaint to a national synod, which, it was hoped, would, at the earliest opportunity, be convened, when it would come regularly under the cognizance of that assembly, and receive the most ample discussion. When this answer had been delivered, the deputies of the synod did not hesitate earnestly to ask it as a particular favor, that by that kind of permission of their lordship, that they might propose those 9 questions to the professors of divinity, and might, without troubling their lordships, personally inform themselves what answers of his own accord, and without reluctance, each of those 3 divines would return. But after all their pleadings, they were unable to obtain the permission which they so strenuously desired. The whole of this unsuccessful negotiation, which was conducted in such a clandestine manner, and so carefully concealed from me, that I was totally ignorant even of the arrival of those reverend deputies in our city. Yet soon after their departure, I became acquainted with their mission and failure. And so one of the reasons kind of matters here is, this is sort of like, Arminius is sort of starting his case here of saying, hey, this is what they've done, and and we're going to read through this. He's laying out, right sort of from the get-go, as has already been sort of demonstrated in our first reading, and our first 2 videos, really. There is a lot of bad faith from actors involved in this, and Arminius is pointing to that already here in this, and he's like, hey, they're trying to go behind, they're trying to break proper procedures, they're trying to do things out of the proper order, and they are not only trying to do it one way, they're trying to do it 2 ways, and trying to do it secretly too, and not being very open and public about it. So that's an important foundation here. And this is an important note. At the end of this, Gunter adds an important note here. For Arminius' full response, see his apology against 31 defamatory articles. We will be reading through that at some point on our own, but it might also be labeled. Let me see if I can find the label here. The Apology of Jacob Arminius, or something of that. I believe in this one, it is not in this one. I'm sure it is, but it's something like an apology or an answer to the questions from Jacob Arminius. And it was a bunch of false accusations levied at Jacob Arminius. The difference between the 9 questions and the 31 articles is the result of continued expansion of suspicions and questions. And we'll get into sort of the history of that here as we go on here. It's important. This was in 1605. This next one picks up in 1607. And this will be a meeting at the Provincial Synod of South Holland, not the National Synod that this first one was talking about. It's about to read from that one. After this, a whole year elapsed before I was again called to an account on such matters. But I must not omit to mention that in the year 1607, a short time before the meeting of the Synod of South Holland at Delft, John Bernards, minister at the Church of Delft, Festus Hamas, minister of Leyden, and Diabetus of Dort were deputed by the synod to come to me and inquire what progress I had made in the refutation of the Anabaptist. When I had given them a suitable reply concerning that affair, which was the cause of much conversation among us on both sides, and when they were just on the point of taking their leave, they begged that I would not hesitate to reveal them whatever views and designs I had formed on the subject of religion, for the purpose of their being communicated to the synod by the deputies for the satisfaction of the brethren. But I refused to comply with their entreaties, because the desired explanations could not be given either conveniently or to advantage, and I did not know any place in which it was possible to explain these matters with greater propriety than in the National Synod, which, according to the resolution of their most noble and high-mindedness, the States General was expected very shortly to assemble. I promised that I would use every exertion that I might be enabled in that assembly openly to profess the whole of my sentiments, and that I would employ none of the alleged concealment or dissimulation, sort of like lying or obfuscation, about any things of which they might then complain. I concluded by saying that if I were to make my profession before them as deputies of the Synod of South Holland, I could not commit to their fidelity the relation of what might transpire, because in matters of this description, every one of the most competent interpreter of his own meaning. Everyone was the most competent interpreter of his own meaning. After these mutual explanations, we parted from each other. And Gunther has an important note here. The request from the Synod was, Arminius had been working on this refutation of the Anabaptist. And he has letters from Arminius to Unbogart in January 26 and May 26 of 1600 that he was putting a lot of work into this particular project. But you can see this in Jacob Arminius' works as well, in some of his translation of his letters, number 56, I believe. In the letter is October 1st, 1602. If you read Carl Bangs, he'll date it to October 10th. The letters indicate that Arminius feared that his opponents were looking for carelessly worded pronouncements on regeneration, free will, and predestination. And he is proven right as time goes on. Maybe not these particular individuals, but we'll get into that. It is absolutely clear, and I know I've harped on this a lot, and we'll continue on in the series. Arminius is recognizing that there are people who are not acting in good faith. There are people who are slandering him, right? They are just breaking the 10 Commandments and slandering him and bearing false witness. And he's aware of this, and he is suspicious of many parties, as he rightfully should be. Back to this. In addition to these applications, I was privately desired by certain ministers not to view it as a hardship to communicate my views and intentions to their colleagues, the brethren assembled in synod, while others entreated me to disclose my views to them. They might have an opportunity of pondering and examining them by themselves in the fear of the Lord. And they gave me an assurance they would not divulge any portion of the desired communication to the first of these two classes. I gave in common my usual answer, that they had no reason for demanding such an account of me rather than from others. But to one of these ministers, who was not among the last of these two kinds of applicants, I proposed a conference at 3 different times concerning all the articles of our religion, in which we might consider and devise the best means that could possibly be adopted for establishing the truth on the most solid foundation, and for completely refuting every species of falsehood. It was also a part of my offer that such conference should be held in the presence of certain of the principal men of our country, but he did not accept of this condition. To the rest of the inquirers I returned various answers, in some of which I plainly denied for what they requested me, and in others I made some disclosures to the inquirers. My sole rule in making such a distinction was the more intimate and or distant degree of acquaintance which I had with the parties. In the meantime, it frequently happened that a short time after I had thus revealed anything in confidence to an individual, it was slanderously related to others. How seriously soever he might have asserted in my presence that when I had imparted to him what I had then imparted to him was, according to his judgment, agreeable to truth, and though he had solemnly pledged his honor that he would on no account divulge it. Right, people, as I just talked about, are bearing false witness. They're taking some of the things he's saying and portraying them wrongly. And I'm assuming Arminius knows at least some of these individuals. We gather he deduces who one of the individuals for sure. And remember this will be important as we read through this next section, not this next section, but probably the next video, this charge against him. Like, why aren't you telling people these things? It's very telling, though, these people are not willing to do it in the presence of others. They don't want these other witnesses there. And if you're doing things on the up and up, there should not necessarily be a problem, especially when you're not doing it in any sort of formal proceedings. These are Arminius is offering private conversations with these guys and saying, I'll talk with you, but I want this other person there. I want someone there who can verify what's happening, basically. And these other people are saying, no, I won't do it. Now, clearly, Arminius talks to a few people, and it doesn't necessarily go as one would hope. But this next section, as we're going to move right along here, because that will be important as we move forward through this, is the preparatory convention. And I'll read this quick note here before we get into this, so we can just focus on the reading here. This preparatory convocation, talking about it's sort of like a preparatory convention, in anticipation of the National Synod, was of considerable importance because it was the first time that the conflicted groups met one another face to face in a public arena. Right? As I was just talking about, every time into this, they have not been doing this publicly. They've been doing it privately. The differences fell along lines both of agenda and procedural guidelines. Arminius and Uyttenbogart, along with 2 ministers from Utrecht, brought a minority report to the States General, while the majority were represented by 13 clergy from across the United Provinces. From the very outset, there was considerable unrest across the provinces to the announced intention by the States General that the National Synod would convene a conversation around a review of the Belgic Confession and the Catechism of the Churches of the Netherlands. Given the general state of unrest, it is understandable that this planned National Synod did not take place until 1618, by which time the political climate had changed considerably. And this is a super important thing before we get into this to sort of emphasize the importance on what this National Synod is. So in this time in the Netherlands, they have very recently broken free from, at a time when state and church were one, from the Roman Church and the governments tied to them in the Netherlands. And this was not a peaceful affair. Jacob Arminius' own family died in the revolution. They were killed. And it was a very bitter and violent war. But now the Netherlands are reformed, and so is their state government. So in a world where state and religion are so closely tied, it is a matter of national concern when you're fairly recently conformed. As at this time in the Reformed, there's only 2 forms of unity. Now in our days, in our modern time, some will hold to 3 forms and will hold to 4 forms, and that's basically their confessional documents. At this time, there's only 2, the Belgic Confession and the Heidelberg Catechism. So when your country is fresh out of a revolution, right, for many people, it's still fresh in their memories. Jacob Arminius is not a young man, but many of the people who are older than him, and Jacob Arminius himself, do remember those the revolution very vividly and very bitterly. When they are meeting then to discuss these confessional documents, they're not just discussing the faith. They're discussing things that are going to impact how the entire country is run. So this is a matter of national importance, and people are nervous. The news of the controversy with Arminius and these others is not, it's not secret. People are aware there's controversy and there's contention going on. This matter is as much political as it is theological, and it ends up having big consequences. Jacob Arminius, of course, dies. The Synod of Dort, right, 1619 is when it's held. He dies in 1609. He does not live to see it. And there's a bunch of important history that goes into why the Synod of Dort ends up the way it did. And we'll get in. Actually, we'll discuss that briefly now as well, right? It's about a 10-year period between Arminius' death and the Synod of Dort. And a lot of what happened between 1609 and 1619 was really bad. The Remonstrants is sort of the party that picked up, if you will, supposedly had picked up anyway. They strayed a lot of ways from Jacob Arminius' theology, and of course we can trace his theology back to the early church. They strayed from that line of theology in a lot of ways very quickly. And part of that was from something known as the Pamphlet Wars, which was the Remonstrants party, as they became known, interacting with many Reformed to various degrees. And the Remonstrants, for whatever reason, had basically formed their alliance with the political enemies, or perceived political enemies of the Netherlands. So they were working a lot with merchants and such like that, who were very friendly with Roman Catholic governments around their area. And for a lot of those who were faithful to the Netherlands, as they were viewing it as the now newly freed people, they viewed that as political treachery. And that caused a lot of tension And the reaction from both parties was not to have a calm and civil discourse on it. It was not to try and compromise and focus on the things they agreed upon and the benefit of their nation. It was to focus on their differences. And in a lot of places, they went as far as they could from the other one out of spite. The pamphlet wars were a nasty business, and there was a lot of other nasty business there. But the sin of both those parties was really hating each other rather than loving each other as brothers and sisters in Christ. And their hatred led them to push as far away from each other as possible. But by the time we get to the Synod of Dort, the remonstrance is not even really truly what it was 10 years ago, let alone what it would come to be, even worse once they got exiled. And though I don't agree with the theological decisions of Dort, and I don't agree with the way they handled things, I understand why they did what they did, and agree with it in part because if nothing had been done, a civil war would have broken out in the Netherlands. So that is sort of the political background here that won't matter for these letters, but matters when you're kind of looking at the history that stems after this interaction with Arminius. With that, we can get to the Preparatory Convention. What occurred relative to the same subject of the Preparatory Convention? To these, it is also necessary to add a report in which has been spread abroad by means of letters. Not only within these provinces, but far beyond their confines, it is that in the Preparatory Convention, which was held at The Hague in the month of June 1607, by a company of the brethren who were convened by a summons from their High Mightiness, the State General, after I had been asked in a manner the most friendly to consent to a disclosure, before the brethren then present, of my views on the subject of the Christian faith, I refused. And although they promised to endeavor, as far as it was possible, to give me satisfaction, I still declined to comply with their wishes. But since I find by experience that this distorted version of the matter has procured for me not a few proofs of hatred and ill will from many persons who think that far more honorable deference ought to have been evinced by me towards that assembly, which was a convention of divines from each of the United Provinces, I perceive a necessity is thus imposed upon me to commence at the very origin of this transaction, when I am about to relate the manner in which it occurred. Before my departure from Leyden for the convention at The Hague, which has just been mentioned, 5 articles were put into my hand, said to have been transmitted to some of the provinces, to have been perused by certain ministers and ecclesial assemblies, and considered by them as documents which embraced my sentiments on several points of religion. These points on which they pretended to exhibit a correct delineation were predestination, the fall of Adam, free will, original sin, and the eternal salvation of infants. When I had read the whole of them, I thought that I had plainly perceived, from the style in which they were written, who was the author of them, and as he was present, being one of the numbers summoned on that occasion, I accosted him on the subject, and embraced that opportunity freely to intimate to him that I had good reasons for believing those articles to have been of his composition. I think it's funny they use the word accosted there. Here, Gunter translates it as confronted. Just amuses me. He did not make any attempt to deny the correctness of this supposition and replied that they had not been distributed precisely as my articles, but as those on which the students at Leyden had held disputations. In answer to this remark, I told him, of one thing he must be very conscious, that by the mere act of giving circulation to such a document, he could not avoid creating a grievous and immediate prejudice against my innocence, and that the same articles would soon be ascribed to me as if they had been my composition, when in reality, as I then openly affirmed, they had neither proceeded from me nor accorded with my sentiments, and, as well as I could form a judgment, they appeared to me to be at variance with the word of God. Just going to read a little note in the manuscript, the Dutch manuscript. Gunter notes there was a marginal note written in, indeed, they do not conform to the word of God, not a single one of them, as they are presently composed. But this shows, right, that this is a very real case of he is being slandered. There is false witness being bared against him. And Gunter notes here, it's perhaps Wernius Helmicus, a co-pastor in Amsterdam, may have been the composer. And the list of points which Arminius was brought under suspicion in these 5 articles was the ones later expanded into the 31. And as Arminius notes, right, this man's not a fool. He knows by allowing and in being involved in the circulation and spread of these, if not the penmanship himself, he is doing to Jacob Arminius a very grievous wrong. It's as plain as that. After he and I had thus discoursed together in the presence of only 2 other persons, I deemed it advisable to make some mention of this affair in the convention itself, at which certain persons attended who had read those very articles and who had, according to their own confession, accounted them as mine. Right? He's talking to people who said, "Oh, we read these and thought they were your beliefs." This plan I accordingly pursued. And just as the convention was on the point of being dissolved, and after the account of our proceedings had been signed, and some individuals had received instructions to give their high mightiness, the States General, a statement of our transactions, I requested the brethren not to consider it an inconvenience to remain a short time together, for I had something which I was desirous to communicate. They assented to this proposal, and I told them that I had received the 5 articles which I held in my hand, and the tenor of which I briefly read them. That I discovered they had been transmitted by a member of that convention into different provinces, that I was positive concerning their distribution in Zeeland and the diocese, in the diocese of Utrecht, and that they had been read by some ministers in their public meetings, and were considered to be documents which comprehended my sentiments. Yet, notwithstanding, I protested to the whole of that assembly, with a good conscience, and as in the presence of God, that those articles were not mine, and did not contain my sentiments. Twice I repeated this solemn asseveration, and besought the brethren not so readily to attach credit to reports that were circulated concerning me, nor so easily listen to anything that was represented as proceeding from me, or that had been rumored abroad to my manifest injury. To these observations a member of the convention answered that it would be well for me, on this account, to signify to the brethren what portion of those articles obtained my approbation, and what portion I disavowed, that they might thus have an opportunity of becoming acquainted in some degree with my sentiments. Another member urged the same reasons, to which I replied that the convention had not been appointed to meet for such a purpose, and that we had already long enough detained together, and that their high mightiness, the States General, were now waiting for our determination. In that manner we separated from each other, no one attempting any longer to continue the conversation. Neither did all the members of the convention express a joint concurrence in that request, nor employ any kind of persuasion with me to prove that such an explanation was in their judgment quite equitable. Besides, according to the most correct intelligence, which I have since gained, some of those who were then present declared afterwards that it was part of the instructions which had been previously given to them not to enter into any conference concerning doctrine, and that if a discussion of that kind had arisen, they must have instantly retired from the convention. These several circumstances therefore prove that I was very far from being solicited by the whole assembly to engage in the desired explanation. Right, that is such an important note there. That there is clearly a party involved in sending out these men who does not want Jacob Arminius to be heard out. Some of these men read these 5 articles and thought they were his, and as Jacob Arminius himself put it, they are not in conformance with the word of God. So there is a not small party moving behind the scenes with influence, trying to defame and slander Jacob Arminius. And bear in mind, he is talking to someone who, at the start of this, he's like, this appears to be your writing. And then the guy doesn't deny it. So I want you to put yourself in those shoes. I am putting myself in those shoes. If I were in front of the man who I know has written slander about me and broken one of the 10 commandments and is actively pursuing me with not just, having my job taken away from me. That's one of the consequences. He's pursuing severe legal action against Jacob Arminius. The consequence for being a heretic, they're not good. This is when Satan religion's the same. Jacob Arminius's livelihood, his well-being, his health and safety, his health already in decline, is on the line here, and he's aware of this. If I were before men who had been slandering me and doing this, I would not have been as calm as Jacob Arminius was. And as he is throughout much of this conversation, he gets in plenty of snide remarks, don't get me wrong. He makes a few hits here throughout this writing and in his various other works. But the way he handles it is, I think, a good way to look at how we should strive to try and handle these kind of confrontations when this happens to us, because we are not perfect. Sometimes our brothers and sisters will sin against us, and Jacob Arminius is doing his best to be respectful and to show love and charity towards these people, and is not just returning the favor and slandering them and trying to pursue all sorts of vengeful actions against them. He's not trying to take revenge. He's not trying to ruin these people as they're trying to ruin him. He's just trying to defend himself, to make an argument that his beliefs are in line with what at the time are the two forms of unity, which they are, and is just encouraging people to try and keep in mind the Christian faith and how we are called to live. And that's something he does throughout a lot of his writings. And that's his plea to them. I can't imagine myself in this position. Hopefully I never have to be in this position, but if I am, I can't in good conscience think to myself that I would try to do it like this. I would be angry, I would be bitter, and I would definitely be trying to take some things into my own hands here. I think that's where we're going to leave that there. We are just going to read a little bit of this next section. It's quite long. We're not going to finish it here today, but is his reasons for refusing a conference here. And I'm going to try and get through a few of these. I think I've only got one note to read from these. So this is his reasons for refusing a conference. Most noble and potent lords, this is the true narration of those interviews and conferences which the brethren have solicited, and of my continued refusal, from the whole of which every person may, in my opinion, clearly perceive that there is no cause whatever for preferring an accusation against me on account of my behaviors throughout these transactions, especially when he considers their request, with the manner of which it was delivered, and at the time of my refusal, with the reasons for it. But this is still more obvious from my counter-proposal. Their request that amounted to a demand upon me for a declaration on matters of faith was not supported by any reasons as far as I am enabled to form a judgment. For I never furnished a cause to any man why he should require such a declaration from me rather than from other people, by my having taught anything contrary to the word of God or to the confession and catechism of the Belgic churches. At no period have I ceased making this avowal, and I repeat it on this occasion. I am likewise prepared to consent to an inquiry being instituted into this my profession, either by a provincial or a national synod, that the truth of it may by that means be made yet more apparent, if from such an examination that it may be thought possible to derive any advantage. The manner in which their request was delivered proved of itself to be a sufficient obstacle, because it was openly made by a deputation. I was also much injured by the way in which the synod prejudged my cause, for we may presume that it would not, through its deputies, invite any man to a conference unless it had given strong grounds for such an interview. For this reason I did not consider myself at liberty to consent to a conference of this description, lest I should, by the very act, and apparently through a consciousness of guilt, have confessed that I had taught something that was wrong or unlawful. The reasons of my refusal were these. First, because as I am not subject to the jurisdiction either of the North Holland Synod or of that of the South Holland, but have other superiors to whom I am bound to render an account of all my concerns, I could not consent to a conference with deputies except by the advice of those superiors, and at their express command, especially since a conference of this kind was not incumbent on me in consequence of the ordinary discharge of my duty. It was also not obscurely hinted by the deputies that the conference in 1605 would by no means be a private one, but this they discovered in a manner sufficiently intelligible when they refused to enter into a conference with me, divested of their title of deputies. I should therefore have failed in my obedience to my superiors. If I had not rejected a conference which was in the manner proposed, I wish the brethren would remember this fact, that although every one of our ministers is subject as a member to the jurisdiction of the particular synod to which he belongs, yet not one of them has hitherto dared to engage in a conference without the advice and permission of the magistrates under whom he is placed. That no particular magistrates have ever allowed any minister within their jurisdiction to undertake a conference with the deputies of the churches, unless they had themselves been previously granted their consent, and that it was frequently their wish to be present at such conference, in the persons of their own deputies. Let it be recollected what transpired at Leyden in the case of Koolhaasius, at Gouda with Herman Herberts, at Hoorn in the case of Cornelius Wigeri, and at Meidenblik in the case of Taco. We are going to pause there for just a second. First note, as he brings out the history, in that first incident in 1605 when they sort of, right, they failed to get their plea through the magistrates, and then they're like, can we have a private conversation? That was breaking all precedent up to that point. But these individuals he named, Casper, Gouda, Cornelius, and Meidenblick, all sort of get covered in this in note 31. Caspar Koolhaas was living in Amsterdam at the time, having been dismissed from the ministry because it was believed that these ministers taught contrary to the Belgic Confession and Heidelberg Catechism. Formal inquiries had been initiated against each of them. And he cross-references a work by Honderdahl. And there's an extended biographical information about all of them in the footnotes of a version of Jacob Arminius' works, which I don't have, so I can't give you a free resource to that. But the biographies all sort of point out these men are condemned. They are investigated. They are, in fact, for the very things Arminius has been accused of going against the confessions and the confession and the catechism, they are actually properly investigated, where he is never properly investigated in that same manner. They are brought up into legal problems, right? And Jacob Arminius goes before people and makes a defense, but he's never actually investigated in these same ways. He's never condemned either, as some of these guys were. So that's super important to understand in the historiography of what is happening here, and in Jacob Arminius' case, right? And this is one of the things that I find really frustrating in a lot of Arminian and Reformed dialogues today, in my experience, where a lot of people just don't read Jacob Arminius and the history in the first place, but especially when they start taking it from just secondary or third sort, or even later sources, secondary and later sources, where they don't portray the information correctly from their biases or just not knowing the information. And they'll try and obfuscate. Like when I asked the question, why was Jacob Arminius never condemned? Why was he never officially investigated? Why was he never removed from his office as professor? Why was he never removed from leading the school for a short time? Why was he never removed from rector? Why was his ordinations never removed? Why was he never removed from the pastorship? Right? Why were none of these things done to him when they had been done to others? And he could point to those others. And they'll obfuscate and say, right, he was being protected by somebody, but that there was politics involved. And I'm like, there are powerful and tons of parties working against Jacob Arminius. It makes no sense to look at what happened in Jacob Arminius' life and say that he was, in his time, going against the two forms of unity in such a way to cause problems, or in such a way that he could be condemned for doing so. Right? I'm with Jacob Arminius, right? At his times, the Synod of Dort changes things, right? Arminian theology is no longer compatible with Reformed theology, but in his lifetime it was. And that was his entire argument and his plea, is that what I am teaching is compatible within the two forms of unity and has ancient Christian roots into the early church and to the scriptures. This isn't novel, this isn't new, this isn't dangerous, and we need to learn to basically to get along and to actually love each other as we are called to love each other. And a bunch of people just couldn't do that. Now, of course, by the time the Synod of Dort happens, that changes things. The Remonstrance is a different matter altogether, and history changed from that course. But in Jacob Arminius' lifetime, that point still stands strong. Back to it. We'll get through the next two reasons, and then we'll end there. The second reason by which I was dissuaded from a conference is this. I perceived that there would be a great inequality in the conference which was proposed, when, on the contrary, it is necessary that the greatest equality should exist between the parties who are about to confer together on any subject. For one, they come to me armed with public authority, while with respect to myself, everything partook of a private character. And I am not so ignorant in these matters as not to perceive the powerful support which man enjoys who transacts any business under the sanction of the public authority. And two, they were themselves 3 in number, and had with them 2 deputies of the Synod of North Holland. On the other hand, I was alone and destitute not only of assistants, but also of persons who might have acted as witnesses of the proceedings that were then to have commenced, and to whom they as well as myself might have safely entrusted our several causes. And 3, they were not persons at their own disposal, but compelled to depend on the judgment of their superiors. And they were bound most pertinaciously to contend for those religious sentiments which their superiors had within their own minds determined to maintain. To such a length was this principle extended that they were not even left to their own discretion to admit the validity of the argument which I might have adduced, however cognate and forcible they might have found them to be, and even if they had been altogether unanswerable. From these considerations, I could not see by what means both parties could obtain that mutual advantage, which ought properly to accrue from such a conference. I might have gained some beneficial result from it, because I was completely at liberty, and by employing my own conscience alone in forming a decision, I could, without prejudice to anyone, have made those admissions which my conviction of the truth might have dictated to me as correct. Of what great importance this last circumstance might be, your lordships would have most fully discovered by experience had any of you been present in the preparatory convention as the representatives of your own august body. My third reason is that the account which they would have rendered to their superiors after the conference could not but have operated in many ways to my injury, whether I had been absent or present at the time when they delivered the report. One, had I been absent, it might easily have happened either through the omission or the addition of certain words, or through the alteration of others, in regard to their sense or order, that some fact or argument would be repeated in a manner very differently from that in which it really occurred. Such an erroneous statement might also have been made either through the inconsiderateness which arises from a defect in the intellect, through the weakness of an imperfect memory, or through a prejudice of the affections. 2. And indeed, by my presence, I could with difficulty have avoided or corrected this inconvenience, because a greater degree of credit would have been given to their own deputies than to me, who was only a private individual. For the record, there are historical cases that where a man is there to defend himself and say things, and his words are overridden by those who are in authority above him. Lastly, by this means I should have conveyed to that assembly, the provincial synod, a right and some kind of prerogative over me, which, in reference to me, it does not actually possess, and which, consistently with that offer, whose duties I discharged, it would not be possible for me to transfer the synod without manifest injustice towards those persons under whose jurisdiction it has been the pleasure of the general magistracy of the land to place me. Imperious necessity, therefore, as well as equity, demanded of me to reject the terms on which this conference was offered. And that is where we're going to stop. We're going to pick up there. Get this book. I think Gunter's commentary and such is invaluable on this. There's a lot of great notes. And I accidentally pressed the stop button there. That's why there's a cut there. Sorry about that. It's super great. This is super great resource for looking into things. And there was a footnote I think I missed here. I did. So in part of this discussion, it comes up the importance of Jacob Arminius's previous writings, and this in the preparatory convention part. On the importance of disputations, it points to this book, actually. Another great book I also highly recommend is Jacob Arminius, Theologian of Grace, and the importance of the disputations in what they do. Stenglen highlights the key functions of disputations on pages 37 through 46 of this work. They provided a snapshot of the professor's opinions at a particular time on a specific topic. They provided an appropriate context for the professor to set out his opinions, and they provided the professor with the opportunity to defend his position, while offering others the chance to challenge this position. And if you don't know what they're talking about there were public and private disputations. That's the note on the students' disputations. Wait, no, it's not. But as Stenglen and McCall do in their work, when they go to sort of discuss, right, that was the note on the students' disputations. What was the importance of the theological disagreement on predestination? That's kind of what the heart of the disagreement is between Arminians and Reformed. They had to outline a lot of Jacob Arminius' other theology long before they ever got to that point, because predestination is not one of those primary things. It's not one of the things that makes you a Christian or not a Christian, depending on your specific understanding of it. It is an important issue for sure, but it's not one. It is ultimately like a core fundamental of the faith, and plenty of places have found ways to work allowing both views. The Anglican tradition is an example of that. There was a time in the Methodist tradition where that was more common. It's not as common now today. Now they're sort of more two distinct groups. That's its own history there. But there have been times the Reformed and Arminians have worked together in the past, especially with dealing with people like I always want to call him Shoemaker Schadlmacher. He's a huge heretic, and stuff like that. So there are ways that this particular bridge has been gapped in the past and still in its present day. But there's also a great, conversation to be had about like the messy history of Jacob Arminius, the Remonstrance party that followed him, and then the Reformed party and governments at the time, and then the fallout of that. It's like those are three distinct moments in history, and they have a huge impact on how the Reformed tradition ends up shaping up, right? There's a large difference between the Reformed tradition as a whole, when it only has the two forms of unity and Jacob Arminius is alive, and then a distinct difference post Synod of Dort. A lot of groups are removed, a lot of things get more narrowly defined, as they happen with all controversies. The Reformed tradition becomes more narrow and becomes more defined, and that's normal. That happens a lot. But the way in which that is handled and the reasons behind which it is handled that way is a super important study into we as the church need to look at today, as to how to handle controversies and how not to handle these types of controversies, and how to try and pursue Christian love and charity rather than attacking and destroying each other. And that's where I'm going to leave that there today. That's its own video and own series of videos, and I'm probably going to try and do that at some point. That will be a big endeavor in the making. With that, you guys have a wonderful day. God bless. See you next time.